Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. Do Christians have a future in the Arab world? Now, it's a question raised with a new sense of urgency as an extraordinarily violent brand of jihadi extremism sweeps through Syria and Iraq. Tens of thousands of Christians, along with other minorities too, have been forced from their homes, hundreds murdered. Right across the region, Christians are fearful. My guest is Bishop Angaelos of the Egyptian Coptic Church. What can the outside world do to protect the Arab Christian tradition? Bishop Angaelos, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
I've just referred to what is happening in Iraq and Syria today. Has that engendered a new level of fear amongst Christians across the Middle East, do you think?
I think it presents a very different dynamic. Christians throughout centuries have been facing challenges. And in particular, over these last few months, it has reached a new level.
Is it qualitatively different? I mean, we've seen political Islam for decades and decades in different forms in the Middle East, but is there something qualitatively different, in your view, about what's happening today?
We haven't seen an exercising of a caliphate in recent history. We haven't seen the direct imposition of jizya in recent history. And I think the formalization of those, unless they are reacted to, are going to create viable models to be replicated throughout the region.
You talk about the jizya, the taxation, or the demand that if taxes are not paid, Christians must flee or indeed face death in certain circumstances. I mean, what we have learned about the treatment of Christian communities, it should be said, other minorities like the Yazidis too, is so horrific, so shocking. But I come back to this point where if you are a Christian living, say, in the West Bank or indeed in Egypt today, are you looking at what is happening there and are you thinking, I need to be worried about this?
I think throughout the region, yes. Egypt has a very specific dynamic, and I think we've seen that because the vast bulk of Christians are in Egypt, we're talking about millions of Christians, the dynamic is not as intense there. But I think when you look at the countries like Iraq, like Syria, West Bank, throughout the Middle East, I think people must be very worried.
Now, you have referred in the recent past to the incredible silence of the international community in the face of persecution of minorities in the Middle East. That's a pretty damning statement.
When we look at Iraq having hit the headlines in the past few weeks, people don't realize that Mosul was overtaken in June. And for a long time, no one was saying anything. And I think I was very happy last week to see suddenly the spotlight being cast on it. But whether it was in Mosul or earlier in Syria in certain areas, or even what happened in Egypt a year ago in August when churches were burnt and attacked, there has been an incredible silence. And I think the problem is so much is happening in the region that we tend to have a single focus on a single area. And once something happens, it moves on to the next area. So we don't address the past anymore, and it becomes the past very quickly now.
It's become a very active debate in the Christian community in the United Kingdom. The Bishop of Leeds, for example, very recently wrote a letter to Prime Minister David Cameron saying, we, that is, we in Britain, do not seem to have a coherent or a comprehensive approach to Islamist extremism. I'm sure you saw those words. Did you think they were correct?
I saw the Bishop's letter, as I saw the Prime Minister's letter earlier this week.
And when he talked about a generational struggle, I think he said, a generational struggle against a poisonous extremist ideology. It seemed to be a message saying, I get it. But do you think the politicians in the West, in nominally Christian countries, get it?
I think they get it once it represents a very particular risk to their own countries. But if it's, as long as it's arm's length, serving somewhere else, it doesn't really matter. And that's understandable. Politicians primary objective is the securing of their own nations, which is understandable. But when you look at the global community and looking at needs of places, for instance in Iraq or Syria or Egypt, where people can't represent themselves, and I'm not talking about specifically boots on the ground, as has been spoken about, or even intervention. I'm just speaking about saying this is wrong and something needs to be done, and having a, as you say, a coherent but also a holistic approach. You can't have policy on one hand, humanitarian aid on another, interreligious dialogue on the third, and then actually have no correlation between them.
Right, but isn't this where Christian church leaders get themselves into a terrible tangle? Because in the recent past, the church has made a strong stand against military interventions, led, I suppose, by the Pope and the Vatican. You know, they for years have stuck to this idea that never again war has been their mantra. But now that Christians are so specifically being targeted, it looks as though some Christian leaders, and maybe even the Vatican too, are beginning to revisit whether that mantra should always apply, particularly when Christians themselves are in direct danger.
I mean, I know for a fact, and I speak about Egypt most because that's what I know most about, I would never have asked for external military intervention, because that's not going to work unless you get a solution from within.
But what, you know, sometimes when innocent civilians, in this case innocent civilians, are being targeted purely because of their religion, which happens to be in this case Christian, what else is there but military intervention to protect?
There are, I mean, first and foremost, we need to protect them by moving them and securing where they are. I'm not a military strategist. Sometimes it may be necessary. It's something I wouldn't ask for a first port of call. Because, of course, if there's a peaceful solution, if there is a solution by reconciliation and bringing people together to understand.
But what reconciliation can, I mean, in a way, coming back to my opening question about the qualitative difference now that we look at this Islamic State movement, what kind of dialogue, reach out, negotiation can there be with the Islamic State?
From what I read and what I see, I think they are making it very, very clear that there is no realm for reconciliation or reaching out. Because the perspective has become so narrow that it's not just Christians or even minority religions, it is other Muslims who are also being targeted. So unless you fit into that very tight mold of what they see Islam should be in that area, even if you're a Muslim, you are targeted.
So isn't this where you, and I know you've travelled the world preaching bridge building, reconciliation, interfaith dialogue, isn't this where you, with your high-minded Christian values, run into reality, and reality just doesn't work in the way that you would like it to?
As a Christian, I would say that, of course, there's that reality, but also we live with the ideal of peace. And it's not up to me to advocate for war. I present a peaceful solution. The war solution is for other people, but I'm always the reconciler. I'm always the one who presents a different solution.
But you are, if I may say so, you run the danger of failing your people. If you say, I represent dialogue, talk, reconciliation, that is my solution, and yet in the same breath you recognize that the people you're dealing with aren't interested in that, you run the risk of fundamentally failing your community.
But I think the realism is that dialogue and reconciliation only happen when all parties are open to it. You can't have dialogue with one party alone. And so dialogue only works when everyone wants to come to a table, and dialogue and reconciliation only happen when there is conflict. But unless people want a solution to that conflict, then if they have burnt all those bridges, and
which they have,
and the final solution is that now we are securing territories and the politicians decide to have a military intervention, that is completely within their prerogative.
Right, so you're sort of washing your hands of giving any commentary upon it, but you're sort of suggesting there are circumstances in which military intervention has to happen.
I'm not washing my hands, but I am commenting on where I can. My remit is not on military intervention. My remit is on presenting peace and giving that sort of option. But I also understand that within any state there are various arms. Religion and politics should not mix.
Well, interesting you say that. I'm just going to interrupt you just to put the words of the Pope, Pope Francis, to you, because he's wrestling with this too, just as you are. And he said just the other day, he said, where there is an unjust aggression, I can only say that it is licit, his word, licit, to stop the unjust aggressor. I underscore, he says, the verb stop. I'm not saying bomb or make war, but just stop. and the means that can be used to stop must be evaluated.
I couldn't differ with that at all.
Yeah, well, okay. But the problem is, you and he are just falling short of saying something that actually most ordinary people listening to that would think ought to be said, which is, in certain very specific circumstances, military intervention is the only way.
Well, countries have armies, and there is military intervention when it's needed. So no one is saying that should never be a military intervention, ever. But what we are saying is that should not be a primary or even a secondary approach. But where people are actually being targeted and they need to be secured, then they need to be secured at whatever cost.
All right, let's flip this around a little bit and think about this now from the point of view of decision makers in Western capitals, Washington, D.C., London as well. Do you think that there is some sort of extra obligation upon Western, as I say, nominally Christian countries to look out for, to intervene, to protect Christians in dire straits, as in Iraq or Syria today?
I think there's an obligation to apply the principles we're supposed to live by here, whether it's for Christians or Yazidis or any other
Right, but you'd make no
minority.
distinction between what is happening to Christians or the Yazidis, another minority sect, or indeed Shia Muslims who are facing oppression from Sunni Muslims, or whatever it is. You're saying absolutely no special case or special relationship between Western Christian countries and Christian communities in trouble in the Middle East? I
don't think so, because I mean, first of all, the term a Christian country doesn't really make sense in most contexts. Countries cannot be Christian or Muslim. They may have a Christian ethos or Christian background, but if we are applying what we call Christian principles, then they don't look at anyone with a specific lens. Christianity looks at everyone equally and the protection of human rights and civil liberties equally across the board.
Interesting you say that, because I'm just thinking in my mind as you speak of the attitude taken over many decades by the Israeli government when it comes to the persecution of Jews. We think perhaps of the period after the creation of the State of Israel in the late 1940s, the Israeli government was extraordinarily interventionist in trying to protect and indeed rescue Jews in various Arab countries who were facing direct persecution. They saw it as a duty to bring these people in and to save them. France today has talked about its willingness to take, through the asylum system, Christians from Iraq. But you're saying you don't see that there is an obligation for Christian countries to take that sort of stance.
Again, I struggle with the term Christian countries. I think that countries in the West, where there is a possibility of taking, for instance, asylum seekers, they should open their doors to anyone with a credible case to come in. Of course, you put your priority on where the persecution is greatest. And at the moment in the Middle East, it's obvious, it's irrefutable that the major persecution is against Christians. And so, proportionately, of course, you would give them more assistance and open your doors more, because what we need to remember is, in the past years, when Christians were persecuted in one Middle Eastern country, they moved to another. Iraq, they moved to Syria, and so on. Now, we have failed states all over. So where can they go within that region? The only solution is other countries opening their doors.
Again, a big controversial subject amongst Christian communities in the UK. The Bishop of Leeds, in his letter to David Cameron, said he was very uneasy about the increasing silence about the plight of tens of thousands of Christians who've been displaced, driven from their homeland. He says they seem to have fallen from consciousness in the UK. And I wonder why, he asked. Why is it that their plight appears to be less regarded than that of others?
I think we've become desensitized, and I think we sometimes have almost a positive discrimination because of a post-colonial mindset where we see ourselves here as a Christian country. We see if we stand up for Christians, it's almost something that is inappropriate, so we stand up for other minorities. But if we took those glasses off and looked at need, so there's a big difference between opening doors to refugees, and some people are calling for getting all the Christians out of the Middle East. I think that would be a fundamental flaw.
Do you?
Absolutely.
Because well, he's sometimes described as the vicar of Baghdad, but the Anglican canon who's spent a lot of time working with Anglican communities in Baghdad, Andrew White, the other day he said that it was time to recognize that that the Christian community in Iraq was virtually finished, and that 20 to 30,000 Iraqi Christians would jump at the opportunity to be rescued, airlifted out of Iraq today and given asylum in the United Kingdom. And you telling me that they oughtn't be given that chance?
I'm saying people who don't have another alternative should be given the opportunity. But for us to proactively want to get all the Christians out, which I've heard people ask for, the Christians are an enriching part of Middle East culture and of its past and of its current status. So they're a neutralizing and a reconciling feature as well. To get them out destabilizes them, because they are leaving an ethnic setting.
But what if they want to get out? What if they just feel their lives are in real-time danger?
Oh, absolutely. If they want to get out, they should be. But we shouldn't be trying to get people out, which is what I struggle with. But if people feel the need to get out, if they don't feel that they can protect their families and their livelihood, then they have a human right to live in a secure and protected setting.
It seems to me this is an incredibly important debate for somebody like you, who represents a minority religious group in a vast country like Egypt. You have to decide at what point it's no longer viable to maintain the community and its massive historic tradition in situ, and to what extent you are prepared to contemplate running risks to keep your traditions and your community going.
The church doesn't make those decisions. People make those decisions. So if it was the desire of every Coptic Christian to leave Egypt, during the past few years when there were incredible struggles, they would have done so. Yet what we see...
Well, they can't, though, can they? Many of them couldn't get permission to settle in another country. They wouldn't have the economic wherewithal to leave Egypt.
But many who do still haven't. What some have done when it was very uncertain is to move out and set up an exit strategy just in case the bottom completely fell out. But they have then moved back.
It's just, I'm a little wary, you know, I'm very mindful of the words of an Iraqi Chaldean cleric in Lebanon, Yusuf Denba, who said just the other day, Denha, I should say, he said that France was making a terrible mistake, indicating it would take Christians in seeking asylum from the terrible troubles in Iraq. He said, telling Christians that they have no other option but to emigrate was absolutely the wrong thing to do, and it threatened to destroy historic communities in the Middle East.
But I think there's a difference between a country graciously and welcomely opening up its doors, because I think it's a very good thing, and telling people if you want to come, then come, rather than saying to them, you have no hope, you must leave. And I think that's the point that's being made here. If we say to them, you have no viable existence, that's very different to saying our doors are open if you don't think you can sustain yourselves in some sort of security there.
We've talked a lot about Iraq and Syria because it's so current, but I do want to press you a little bit more on the situation for Coptic Christians in Egypt, which of course is your main priority, your main area of concern. Seems to me there's one difficult area that Coptic Christians have had to tread in recent years in Egypt. Your community, over years, has been supportive of and relatively close to the authoritarian regime of Hosni Mubarak, and after he fell, and now that General al-Sisi has become President al-Sisi, very supportive of al-Sisi too. Do you think that that has been a mistake for Coptic Christians to line up so obediently, supportively, behind authoritarian military government?
I think it's important to find out why people support whoever they fought, whether they support a military government or a socialist setting. It's because that's where they think their interests are.
And that's where they're best protected. Is that what Copts feel?
But where their interests are protected, and it's not just Copts, it's everyone. So it's very difficult to distinguish in the past years during the Mubarak reign who supported him and who didn't. And I think it's oversimplistic to say the Christians did, because the whole country pretty much stood where the Christians stood and the Muslims stood, everyone stood.
Well, you may say that, but I think particularly of the words of your current Coptic Pope, when he very specifically refused to describe the military takeover, the toppling of the Muslim Brotherhood government in 2013 as a coup. He refused to use that word, and he hailed General, as he then was, General al-Sisi, as a hero and a saviour.
Again, they weren't the words of the Pope himself. I think I would still struggle with the word coup. A coup is a military takeover to have a military rule.
Well, that's pretty much what you had, and you also had the locking up of the democratically elected political leadership.
Again, what I don't want to do is to step into the position of protecting or speaking for the military, because I think, again...
Well, I'm asking you to speak for Copts. I just wonder whether it was wise, and continues to be wise, for Coptic Christians to be seen to be so close to that brand of governance.
I don't think it's just the Coptic Christians. I think what happened in the past 2 years was flagged up that the problem in Egypt is not Christian-Muslim. It was an Islamist presence that marginalized a very large bulk of the Egyptian population, Christian and Muslim alike. What happened on the 30th of June was by no means only Christians. And when the Pope spoke, so did Sheikh al-Azhar, so did prominent political leaders. And that was because we didn't have then in Egypt a safeguard. Here in Britain, if the Prime Minister was to do a proportion of what happened in Egypt, there would be safeguards around him. There is parliament, there is a judiciary, there are things that would stop that. In Egypt, there was nothing. When the people called out, had there been an alternative to the military to actually lead that step, they would have followed that alternative.
I understand what you're saying. It seems to me the corollary of what you're saying is that the Arab uprisings, which frankly we can now say have brought terrible disorder to the Middle East, have been deeply damaging to Coptic Christians, and that what Coptic Christians and other minority Christian communities in the region need more than anything else is order. And if it's Hosni Mubarak or General al-Sisi or indeed Bashar al-Assad who provide order, then Christians are going to sort of move toward that sort of order. Am I right?
I'd like to speak with a new paradigm, and that is that I think we should stop singling out Christians or Muslims or otherwise. If we speak about Egyptian citizens, all of them across the board, they're all going to want that stability, whether they're Christian or Muslim, or even secular or religious. And so whatever leadership provides that should be followed. Now, the problem we've had is that we've had leaderships that have followed particular sections of society and not advocated for the whole. And I think that's where people then find it difficult to know who to follow.
I suppose the question post-Arab Spring is whether, frankly, Christian Arabs fear popular uprisings and democracy in the Middle East, because it's bad for them.
Democracy is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And I think that's a very important distinction. We've been selling democracy as this wonderful have-to-have thing for people to become now civilized. Whereas democracy is only a vehicle to bring forth representation, security, stability. And if what we wanted to push as democracy then didn't provide those things, then it failed. And what we need to do is look for a model that provides those things for all those people, Christian or otherwise.
Is it too late for that model? I just look at the numbers. You know, 100 or more years ago, roughly 20% of the Arab world population was Christian. Today it's in the low single digits. Is it too late?
I don't think it's ever too late. I have a perspective as a Christian living in hope that if you look at our history, if you look at the reign of Diocletian and how many Coptic Christians died through that reign, if you look at the 7th century with the introduction of Islam into Egypt, what we're seeing now gives us a very small picture of what was being lived in those centuries. So if we were able to outlive those, we're going to outlive this one. But the thing is, we need to outlive it for the purpose of the whole country. I want us to stop looking at Christians as a whole, but look at the well-being of everyone and see that if we don't protect each other, if we don't get Muslim leaders standing up and saying this is wrong, and if we don't get Christian leaders standing up and supporting them, then no one's going to win.
We have to end there, but Bishop Angaelos, thank you very much for being on HARDtalk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.